Hey guys and girls, welcome to Board Now's review of WCW Wrestlewar 1990. Wild Thing. That's the subtitle. So yes, this is going to be my first review of a wrestling event on the channel, a wrestling pay-per-view. And so this starts a new venture for me. For those of you who don't know, I am a big wrestling fan, especially old school 1980s, 1990s wrestling. Those are the years I've most been interested in, and the years where, well, I sort of grew up really. I first became a wrestling fan or started following the US wrestling in 1990. I remember my first proper pay-per-view was the Survivor Series 1990, and that really captured my imagination, and I slowly became a big fan from there. And I started following WCW a couple of years later, about 92. I remember they used to show it late night on ITV, so I used to watch that and start to get to know some of the characters, some of the feuds, and yeah, became a bigger wrestling fan over the years. But I've got a lot of nostalgia for the 80s and the 90s, and I just feel that's when wrestling was at its best, or certainly that's the period I know the best. And I am one of these people who just thinks that the modern product really isn't very good. It really doesn't. There's a spark that's missing from it, and I mean, I can talk more about the reasons why as I go through, but I just thought it'd be a fun little project to cover some old school wrestling and discuss it and go through it pay-per-view by pay-per-view or event by event. So I will cover some WWF as well / WWE and some older stuff and maybe some other promotions. But I thought this would be an interesting first project, and that is to do every WCW pay-per-view from the 1990s. So cover in order, cover every single pay-per-view of that decade. And it should be a fun ride because really no other company had such ups and downs during the 1990s. I mean, over the course of these reviews, I will be talking about the very best and the very worst of WCW, World Championship Wrestling. And yeah, such an up and down decade. You are going to see some crazy shit from WCW along the way. You will see some of the very best wrestling you will probably ever see as well. There are some great gems, and just so much going on behind the scenes over the course of those 10 years. Much politicking, much changing of the guard, and many highs, and yes, plenty of lows, believe me. But it's a fascinating time, the decade of the 90s. It's obviously when I really got into wrestling, and I have fond memories. Particularly, I think, probably the early 90s, the first couple of years, and then even more so for the very late 90s, or let's say 96, 97, that around that time, 98 as well, where the Monday Night Wars, as they are known, really kicked off, and WCW and WWF went at it to and fro. And it was one hell of a war with some of the most iconic moments in professional wrestling. So a lot of ground to cover, but I'm really looking forward to doing this for you guys. I hope you are fans, or some of you. Maybe I'll encourage people who are casual fans to go back and watch these pay-per-views, some of them. Some of them have to be seen to believe me. So I'm going to go through it match by match, each pay-per-view, and just to say about the rating systems. I will be rating each match sort of with a 5-star system, and I will do half stars as well. I know, like, if you're Dave Meltzer out there, he gets really fancy with his rating system, really precise. He has like 3/4 as well and different stuff. But that's a bit much for me anyway. I'm just gonna stick. I will give half a star occasionally, so 2.5, 3.5, whatever the case may be. But yeah, I won't go any further than that. But for individual matches, I will do the out of 5-star ratings. I think that's the best system for actual matches. But then for the pay-per-view as a whole, I will give a rating out of 10. So I will use the out of 10 system for the overall rating of the pay-per-view, and sometimes there will be a 0.5 as well, so something 0.5 out of 10. Sometimes I'll do a rundown of the show and my overall thoughts and some of the stories surrounding it. And that's basically how it's going to work. And as I said, I will do future projects as well concerning WWF and other stuff. Like I might do a series of, I don't know, for example, SummerSlam review and all of those. That would be a big project as well, but it's doable. But we'll see how it goes. I mean, I wanted to cover this on the channel as it's one of my passions and could stir up some talking points. So yeah, feel free to get involved in the comments if you've seen these events and what you think. So Wrestlewar 90 Wild Thing, as I said, it took place on the 25th of February 1990. It came from the Greensburg Coliseum, Greensburg, North Carolina, which was one of the big sort of cities for the NWA, WCW at the time. It was sort of one of their big hotbeds where they tended to draw healthy crowds, and it was also the sort of home state of Ric Flair, the biggest name in the game at the time, or the biggest name in WCW. He was the NWA World Champion going into this show. He had won it on 6 occasions to date and would win it many more times, or would win a version of the world title many more times in the coming year. But he was, at this time, one of the hottest names in the business, one of the most successful guys, and really carried things for the NWA in many ways. But yeah, he's from Greensburg, North Carolina, so it would be that interesting thing when WCW went there. Even though Flair was a heel on TV, he would get big pops in North Carolina. He would have a strong fan base there, even though he was essentially a heel / bad guy on TV and in general at this time anyway. And he was the leader, of course, of the Four Horsemen, one of the great wrestling stables of all time, maybe the greatest. Him and Arn Anderson involved as well, Ole Anderson at this time. And I think they were just cool heels. I think that was part of it. So the Nature Boy really got over as this really, as the catchphrase goes, limousine riding, jet flying, kiss stealing, son of a gun, Nature Boy Ric Flair. He just had that charisma. He was popular with both men and women, and was just a great wrestler, just a great athlete. So he really stood out. And the Horsemen, certainly they would divide the crowd, but they had a lot of fans as well, which obviously you might say is unusual for heels, but they set that bar in a way. They set that standard for the sort of cool heels, if you like, who fans could get behind. I think there was a relatability as well with the fans and the Horsemen, where although they were kind of these flash, big time Charlies, I think also there was a relatability about them as well. But you could say in some ways they were years ahead of their time in being those sort of cool, relatable heels. But yeah, awesome stuff. Flair was so over at this point. Had some of the best matches of the decade and would continue that really for many years to come. But very much still in his peak in 1990. And he went, as I said, he goes into this as the champion, and the main event is him against Lex Luger. And Luger is the US champion going into this, I think for the third time. So you have champion go versus champion. And there's some logic behind the match because Luger, as the US champion, it was kind of WCW's version of the Intercontinental Belt, which was the WWF's secondary title at the time anyway. The US belt was like their version of that, and it would basically mean that you were the number one contender for the world title if you had the US title. So it really gave it props, it really gave it like prestige. And so Luger going in as a 3-time US champion was really built as one of the future stars, as this bright young talent, and so a logical challenger to Flair. But it also tells the story of the fallout from the whole Sting stuff. So Sting had been a heel recently. He was in the Four Horsemen not too long before this event. But then there was a big buster and they injured Sting's knee and kicked him out of the group. So Sting, although injured, does appear at the show. And I'll get more into his role a bit later on. But the idea is that he's going to rehabilitate himself, get back from injury, and that one day he wants revenge against Flair and the Four Horsemen for putting him on the shelf. So he's going to be involved in the main event as well. But that's the main event, and there's some very interesting matches leading up to that. A few different title matches. But just to give you an idea of the era, so at the start of the 90s, you have the NWA and WCW as a joint sort of promotion. WCW had obviously the original NWA. I mean, not obviously, but in case you don't know, it dates back decades at this point. It dates back to the early 1900s, basically. Ridiculous history. But yeah, it's a joint thing now with them and WCW, and there's some dispute over that because WCW actually claiming some of that history, which isn't really accurate. I mean, WCW came into existence over the last 2 years before this show, so they've been around a couple of years at this time, and they're still using like the NWA title. So they could, rather than, I mean, later there would be a WCW title, but at this point, the belt that Flair's defending is still the NWA. It's called the NWA title, and the tag titles are called the NWA tag titles, etc. So it's a joint sort of project. And what happened is, you sort of had the glory years of the late 80s when it was like the Jim Crockett promotions, and for many fans, many old school fans, that was when the company was at its best, where it put on some of its hottest cards, where it had its most success. Up to this point, I should say. Obviously there's a big period where it surpassed that in the 90s, but up to this point, probably the late 80s was when, I mean, I almost said WCW there, but the NWA, Jim Crockett's promotion, was really at its best. You know, it really had some overstars, drew a lot of sellout crowds, did really solid business, and was considered, you know, kind of, by some at least, the top wrestling promotion, even though it didn't really compete with the WWF. That was so hot during the 80s, but it did. It was certainly a credible number two, and as far as a wrestling promotion goes, and being known more for the wrestling, the quality of the wrestling, then, it was highly regarded in the late 80s, mid-late 80s. But basically Ted Turner brought out the Jim Crockett Promotions, TBS got involved, so they got essentially a national TV deal, so some would see that as a turning point. But as a result, there were changes, and there was kind of seen as less traditional wrestling changes. So basically at this time going into this pay-per-view, you had Jim Herd involved. He was the whatever they call the title, CEO, executive producer. So he was running the show, even though he wasn't involved in creative per se, but he would often obviously kind of stick his oar in. And what we were seeing as a result of Jim Herd's involvement, he was seen as this guy who had no sort of wrestling history. Then he was came from a TV background. And I mean, obviously nowadays wrestling is seen as this big entertainment, this big sort of carnival in a way, and it is a lot of times treated as just an entertainment, as just almost like a TV show, even though the two aren't quite the same. But that's kind of the way it's treated nowadays. Literally every segment almost. And then, you might get a breakaway sort of match where it's taken really seriously. But the way wrestling is produced nowadays is almost very similar to how a TV show would be produced. And obviously that's something I can get more into. But I think at this time, considering what a traditional wrestling promotion we're talking about here, it would be quite a culture change. And I think that's the way Jim Herd viewed it the other way. He was coming from the TV traditions, and he was trying to change it. And the problem with that is many of his ideas were just cartoonish, really. He didn't really get what wrestling was and how wrestling at its best appeals to the audience, and just the sort of characters that fans expected, and how to get that over. He seemed to be really clueless when it came to pro wrestling, so he introduced many really silly and cartoonish ideas. I mean, you had like the humpbacks and the ding-dongs, which were kind of ideas that he thrust on the company and the bookers and stuff like that. But he had this really cartoonish sort of vision, which didn't really sit well with the hardcore fan base. And I mean, there's good ideas and there's bad ideas, but he had a whole slew of bad ideas. He wasn't very popular with most during the company. The way he ran the company in general, that he just really clashed against many of the long-term talent. But so it's a change in direction basically, and you can see some of the hardcore fan base start to rebel against that. So during one of the matches on this show, Wrestlewar 90, we see a sign that says, "We've heard enough," basically. So that's kind of a reaction to Jim Herd and his ways. So, but you still at a point. It's still relatively early, and I think certainly on pay-per-view at this point, you're still getting some really top, really solid sort of matches. But I'll get more into. I won't talk too much detail. I won't go through it bit by bit, but I'll certainly give my overall feelings and some of the highs and lows of the matches. So the attendance in Greensboro, for this show was around. It was close to 10,000, so 9,894. So close to 10,000, which I think during this time is a pretty solid attendance for the NWA / WCW. That's a pretty healthy crowd for the era. I mean, a couple of years prior, they would have been probably getting more than that on average, but certainly for a pay-per-view, a big pay-per-view. But around 10,000 isn't too bad for where they are at this time. And pay-per-view buy rates, it sort of varies the records, but I think it was 175,000 buys at home for this Wrestlewar 90, which again is a decent figure for the time, and it's probably one of the higher buy rates they would get around this time. So around about 175,000 buys for the pay-per-view. And your commentary team for the night, it's Jim Ross and Terry Funk. Jim Ross, who previously had commentated for Mid-South, for the Bill Watts promotion Mid-South, very kind of critically acclaimed promotion over the last decade. And he then went to the NWA and became their mainstay as their top announcer, and eventually would move on to WWF in 1993. And despite some ups and downs, and a bit of heat, he was fired a couple of times. Even through that, he established himself as probably the top announcer in the business, and really got over with fans, and fans loved him. And over his career, Ross has proven he's one of the best announcers of all time. He may well be the best. He sort of patted himself on Gordon Soley, who was a classic announcer back in the day. And Ross, just his dramatic delivery, his descriptions of the matches, he just told a fantastic story. And was kind of the gold standard for many years. He just had a distinct sort of vocal voice. He always, or usually anyway, had very good chemistry with whoever he was paired with, and had a great knowledge of the business. And he did what a commentator should do each time, which was do his best to get the match over, no matter how good or bad. He was really, really good at explaining and getting the story across. So Jim Ross, an absolute legend. So NWA had the best man for the job at this time. His partner Terry Funk had retired from wrestling at this point. I believe it was probably a storyline, and Funk's one of those guys. He's retired so many times over the years. But yeah, he was certainly on a hiatus from the ring at this point. So giving commentary a go on pay-per-views, he'd also commentated at Starrcade 89, which was the last pay-per-view of the previous years. But giving it a go, he's a very colourful character, Funk. Not the best as a commentator, in my opinion. Him and Ross, they were okay together. You got the impression they were quite good friends, and there was a bit of banter at times, which was good. But yeah, Funk, not a natural commentator, even though he was a very colourful character and, stood out as a wrestler, but not the best commentator, in my opinion. And yeah, I remember it at the start of the show. He does one sentence to run down each match on the card, or each big match, and it's pretty useless, to be fair. But I'm going to get into the pay-per-view. 7 matches in total. And the open match, we have a tag team match, and we have the very old school duo of Kevin Sullivan and Buzz Sawyer. So 2 guys who have come up in the territories over the years. Solomon was also involved in the Billionaires Club, and he's kind of one of these classic old school like wrestling crazy madmen type villains. That's kind of his whole sort of shtick, and the 70s 80s were kind of his prime periods for that, and he influenced a lot of future names like Raven, and you can see a bit of him in Jake the Snake, but he was essentially this unorthodox sort of brawler who had this unhinged sort of persona, very colourful, but a lot of psychology as well, a lot of good basic psychology with Solomon. So it's him and Buzz Sawyer going up against the Dynamic Dudes. And the Dynamic Dudes are a good example of the kind of out there ideas that Jim Herd was really coming up with and foisting it on the bookers. So that's Shane Douglas, and it's also Johnny Ace. So they were the Dynamic Dudes. Ace had previously wrestled in Japan, had a bit of a run there. Douglas, very much a newcomer at this point, hadn't really been around a long time, and he would have an interesting career actually, many ups and downs, did have some bright points, but I think for some really overrated, but he had a very good run in ECW. That's probably where he had his most success. And he had, a few different spells in both WCW and the WWF. But we see him very early on here in the Dynamic Dudes. And yeah, the name's ridiculous, of course. And the gimmick is that they're a couple of kind of young punks who ride around on skateboards. So they would actually ride ride isn't the right word, but they would come to the ring on skateboards. That was Herd's vision, if you can believe that. It's absolutely ridiculous. They would have back to the front caps and all that. It feels a bit like they were trying to cash in on the whole Bill and Ted type thing. But that was almost a thing in this, where they would try and push them as these kind of obnoxious sort of kids, these young brash kids, and that they would rub up against people like Solomon and Sawyer, these more harsh old school wrestling characters. But it's kind of a backwards idea to give the characters to faces like that. It should really be more of a heel type thing. So the match itself, I mean, it's not really very good. It's not terrible. There's some solid mat work from Sawyer and Solomon, some really ground and pound type brawling. You have like a standing bear hug at one point. You have Solomon doing his stomp. I think the heels just come across as a bit more interesting than the faces in this. It's a very sort of basic type match. There's quite a nice belly to belly suplexes at one point from Sawyer. But yeah, it's not much of a match. As I said, very basic. And Sawyer gets the pin with the splash off the top rope. And it lasts, sort of close to 10 minutes. But I'll give it 2 stars. So it was, forgettable stuff overall. It's not terrible, but forgettable. So I'll give that opening match 2 stars. And then we have Missy Hyatt in a backstage interview, and she is interviewing Norman the Lunatic. Oh boy, so cartoonish once again, so over the top. And I suppose we have to talk about this character because it is one of those examples of this really sort of silly but also insensitive gimmick. And again, it's the passing of the times and just how different things were. But the fact that you would actually have this, I mean, he's meant to be like a kid-friendly sort of character, but the fact that they're playing up this character who supposedly is mentally challenged, he's said to come from an insane asylum. The fact that they would play that up and make it sort of light and cartoonish, it just shows that this was nearly 30 years ago. It's the sort of thing you couldn't get away with now. It's very different times. So Norman the Lunatic would go on to have an even more embarrassing gimmick a few years later in the WWF as Bastion Booger, this gross big man whose gimmick was he ate a lot, folks. He ate a lot. In fact, once he didn't show up for the 1994 Royal Rumble because he had food poisoning. Yes, that was a thing. That's how they explained him not making the entrance. But that's a future character for him. He sadly passed away now, but yeah, in some ways the Bastion Booger character is more memorable, although maybe not for the right reasons. Who knows? But yeah, so he's playing Norman the Lunatic, this mentally challenged, like kid-friendly babyface. He's interviewed by Missy Hyatt, who for some is the first woman of WCW. I would say Medusa personally, and I'll get to that in a future review. But yeah, Missy Hyatt is this ditzy broadcaster who does a lot of backstage interviews, and yeah, she's hot, folks. She's a gorgeous woman, no doubt about that at the time, and who knows even now. I haven't seen her for a while, but yeah, there's no getting around that. That's why she was hired. She certainly didn't bring a lot to the table in terms of personality, or certainly wasn't a wrestler. She didn't really have in-ring skills, but she was just that very glamorous, very good-looking female character on there, and it was almost a sort of a joke, the fact that she acted so ditzy in interviews. But anyway, Missy interviews Norman the Lunatic, and it's unbelievable, really. They're making Saved by the Bell references, and we get this whole thing where Norman sort of asks if he can kiss her, and at first she's playing along with it, just being nice to not hurt his feelings, so he kisses her on the cheek, and then he kind of wants to do it on the lips, and that's when she does the Saved by the Bell reference, which was, of course, a big show at the time. So they're making lots of TV and cultural type references, which wrestling has done over the years, but that's the interview. Which brings us to the next match, which is Cactus Jack Manson versus Norman the Lunatic. So we're sort of seeing a pattern here where the first couple of matches at least are filler type matches. They don't really feel like worthy pay-per-view matches, but I guess they're just sort of matches that are there just to warm up the crowd, or just to give a chance to like some of the lesser known talent before we get to the big title matches and things like that. So of course Cactus Jack is a name people will know. Cactus Jack Manson, Mick Foley, of course, he went on to become one of the biggest names ever in wrestling, and one of the most successful guys outside of wrestling to have ventures with books and various stuff. He's done stand-up recently. But this is very early in his career. He debuted sometime in the late 80s. Again, he'd sort of come up, because he's from Texas, he'd sort of come up on the Texas scene and various sort of like territory promotions. But this is early on in his WCW career, so it's a chance for him to get exposure on the pay-per-view. And So what we basically get is a comedy style match with him and Norman the Lunatic. Norman comes out with a Sting teddy bear, so they're sort of pushing this idea that because he's like mentally handicapped, then he's kind of then he wears the merchandise of his favourite wrestlers. This is an idea we'd see sort of years later with the Eugene character in the WWF, or E as it was then. Um, but that's kind of the thing. Then he comes out, he doesn't really know what he's doing, but he kind of has this strength and he kind of can hold his own at times. But it's basically a comedy match, and there's this thing throughout the show, I think, with wrestlers kind of showing their support for Sting because of the injury. But it's another forgettable match. Except for a couple of moments, and those involve Cactus Jack and his selling. So we really see Mick Foley and his potential here. We see him do his best with this very limited performer. He does some really great bumps. So he shot out the ring at one point from a pin attempt, and he does this really hard tumble sort of off the ropes to the floor, some big dramatic bumps. He really sells very well for Norman. As I said, he does this insane backdrop sort of over the guardrail. Really dramatic. It looks really good, so it's the way he sells it which really I mean, Mick Foley, Cactus Jack, was really known for putting his body on the line and doing these insane bumps, which at the time you didn't really see in wrestling. And some of it was really legit. I mean, obviously, even though the matches are, sort of predetermined and stuff, I mean, a lot of his bumps and the falls he would take and stuff was actually sort of him really doing it in some of those, like almost like this stunt performer, but really convincing. And he obviously over time he became the whole package because he knew how to sell the matches, he knew about psychology and stuff. But those moments are the highlight of the match. Besides that, you get a lot of goofy comedy stuff which the crowd kind of hated. Yeah, Norman the Lunatic wins when he sort of reverses a sunset flip and drops down, basic sort of sit down, and gets the 1, 2, 3. Norman the Lunatic wins. Oh dear, never mind. I'll give it 1.5 stars. It really wasn't very good. So that's that second match. And the quality really picks up in the third match and the first title match of the night. So it's the US Tag Team Champion. Oh, actually, it's not the US Tag Title. Sorry about that. I'm getting confused. But it is the Rock and Roll Express versus the Midnight Express with Jim Cornette in their corner. So we have one of the great feuds of the era, two of the greatest tag teams of the era, but of all time really. They reinvented tag team wrestling and had this insane series of matches. Famously, it was talked of because they would just do different stuff each night and really raise the bar for this back and forth aerial high flying matches, but also with great wrestling thrown in, sort of karate style kicks as well, and just great psychology and storytelling, some really hot near falls, covers back and forth, and great character interactions. So two of the greatest teams of all times, and they really raised the bar for tag team wrestling during this time. And I have to say, the network version, because when I watched this last, I watched it on the WWE network, and they actually dub in some dance music for the Midnight Express, so it's not actually their Midnight Express theme, which is classic. It's for wrestling, I think it was ahead of the time, although they sort of used it from the film, really, Midnight Express. But it's an awesome wrestling thing. It's like this really pumping sort of synth number. Just love it. It's one of my favourite entrance themes for wrestling. But yeah, you don't get that on the network, unfortunately. And yeah, it's another great match from these two. It's a great rivalry from the time, and you have that classic entrance with Jim Cornette being introduced by Stan Lane. So it's Bobby Eaton, Stan Lane, the Midnight Express. There was a different combination with Dennis Condrey involved, with Bobby Eaton before he left the promotion and Stan Lane took his place, and pretty smooth transition anyway. But yeah, they do this bit when they come to the ring where Stan Lane introduces their manager James E. Cornette, this colourful character with a tennis racket and tuxedo, and he does this awesome kind of interaction on the mic. Cornette, one of the great managers, full stop, but also on the mic and his colourful promos, and the physicality of him at ringside, bouncing back and forth and really whipping up the crowd. And we see a great example of that in this match, because at one point quite early in the match, when things aren't going well for the Midnight Express, they're really taking these heavy bumps. They're being double teamed and bounced around a lot, and really taking a pasting. So he's getting more and more agitated at ringside, and he clashes with the referee, gets up in the referee's face, and they do this whole shadow boxing thing, which is really hilarious, and it sort of puts over the referee in a way. But it's this back and forth where Cornette first of all gets in his face with these dukes, and then when the referee responds, Cornette falls backwards and keeps bouncing back and forth and ends up flat on his face. It's just brilliant, and the crowd absolutely love it. They go nuts for it. But it's just this really creative spot, which I know Cornette mentioned once in an interview. He just came up with randomly on like a house show match, and then they're doing it on this pay-per-view, and the crowd go wild over it. It's brilliant. It's great stuff, and he was a great manager. You really believed in his interactions, in his tactics. But it's this thing where, although it's kind of going OTT, it's believable. Then this eccentric character would get into this stuff with the referee and try to use his personality. But Cornette's a legend. I'll talk more about him in future videos. But we get a nice slow build. We get some solid wrestling back and forth. I like Gibson being a step ahead at one point of one of the Midnight. When they drop down too early, he plants a fist, and there's some back and forth outside the ring. We get some classic sweet arm drags from Ricky Morton. He was known for those really sharp arm drags. I think him and Ricky Steamboat were probably the best arm draggers in the business, and I think that just shows you during this era where obviously you don't get all these flashy, expansive moves like now, that you don't get all the hardcore stuff, but just basic moves like an arm drag or a body slam, that if they're done in the right way, if the other guy sells them, it can seem really, really devastating, like they're really being hurt. And just, it has this poetry to it. So the arm drag off the ropes, and just the smoothness of how he whips him over and then into an armbar. There's a poetry to it. It's simple, but it's really effective, and the crowd really get into it. Every move counts in this match, the slow build up and the back and forth. And yeah, there sort of isn't a wasted spot. It's a very precise match, very well crafted, and it gets the desired crowd response. And there's lots of, like the Rock and Roll outsmarting them, and Eaton taking many shots to the face. As we said, Cornette knocked in and out of the ring. There's a nice double backdrop spot, nice double clothesline by the Rock and Roll. So again, this tag team specialist type thing of these quick guys, almost definitely inspired the Rockers later in the WWF. And obviously some would say the Rockers got over more and took it to the next level, but arguably without the Rock and Roll, there would be no Rockers. So we're seeing this inferential tag team specialist, this fast-paced, babyface team that were really popular with the crowd. Some hard rights, some stiff shots back and forth. Some really, there's a flying double arm, or flying double axe handle at some point by Lane, which sort of turns the tide a bit. Eaton holding on to the ropes as he does that, so a nice stereo sort of move from the heels. Cornette gets involved with his tennis racket at the Hopper 2 moment, and again that's sold brilliantly by Ricky Morton, who really knew how to sell. He really knew how to get the crowd into it and get them rooting for him. And it's so simple, but it's so effective. He really takes the blows very well. And the timing of his comebacks as well is a great example for young wrestlers. But yeah, Cornette with the tennis racket, it really looks like he's really popping in one, and it really hurts. We get Lane, who was the karate specialist of the teams, with these pressing kicks or side kicks to the gut of just punishing Morton, attacking different parts of the body, so that all works very well. So I like the contrast between the Midnight, where Bobby Eaton was the high flyer and more the aerial artist, and you had Stan Lane, who was more the martial arts style guy. So there was a mixture, and they could both wrestle as well and do various things. But they had really good timing together. I really liked the heel, the heel takedown from one, and then from Lane normally, and Eaton would come off the ropes, elbow drop. Really nice, poetry between them. Really nice timing. Smooth elbow drop from Eaton for a 2 count. Eaton, nice standing suplex, again, good basic moves that look really impressive. There's a Lane power slam, which at one point looks like it's going to get the win, but Gibson breaks up the count on 2. So we're slowly building to the hot tag, and it's really logical the way they do it. Morton, is dropped on the guardrail. And there's a sunset flip where it looks like the babyface might catch a break, might get the win out of nowhere, but Cornette is distracting the referee. Smart man. And there's sort of blind tags with the Midnight, which may or may not be legal, but they catch. Well, they are legal, but it's a blind tag, so the Rock and Roll don't notice. And we get an awesome neck breaker by Eaton. Looks really, really good. And Ricky just takes more and more punishment. But eventually he takes shots to the arms. They're working on the arm. And then there's a collision mid-ring. And a rocket launcher. And a double arm, and Morton, but then Morton gets knees up when they're coming off the top, and rolls to. I love the roll through quickly out of the way to make the tag, because that's kind of the only way he can logically do it, because he's breathless, he's been worn down. So he does this nice rolling move to the corner to make the tag. Hot tag to Gibson. He takes on both men because he's obviously super fresh. He's been outside the ring for 5 or 10 minutes at this point. So he's really fired up. Sunset flip, pin attempt. Lane makes the save on that one. The crowd are really getting hyper at this point, really building to a fever pitch. Gibson, there's a tennis racket shot, but he kicks out after that, so a dramatic turn where it looks like the heels are going to steal the rim, but somehow Gibson breaks out and kicks out. All 4 in, so we get now a real sort of brawl between the 4 of them, the heat of the match really getting to fever pitch again. There's a flapjack attempt. Double team, nicely done. And eventually, but off that attempt, Gibson with a cradle out of nowhere, and steals the win. So it's a really nice finish. It's a logical finish because it's, realistically they're tired and they essentially outsmarted the Midnight Express. So the Rock and Roll Express snatched the win away. Really well crafted match, exciting match back and forth, some really logical builds, peefs and chocks, some exciting wrestling moves back and forth, and some great heat. Love Cornette at ringside, he really adds something different to the match, and easily the best match of the night up to this point, and it's going to be up there at the end of the card, but I'm going to give it 4 stars. I absolutely love it. I love these 2 teams. I love their feud, and they had many great and diverse matches, but great match there, and 4 stars for me, the Rock and Roll and the Midnight Express. We now get a change of pace. We get a Chicago street fight, and we have the Skyscrapers with Theodore Along in their corner. So Theodore Along is kind of another one of these classic sort of 80s managers. Very sort of motor mouth, very energetic. He kind of like this almost Pip Street type character where he does a lot of trash talking up to the point where he's actually confronted with a wrestler. So that's kind of his gimmick then. He's very, very sharp talking, kind of outrageous and cocky, but then often is found wanting and it's often gets himself into squeaky situations. But he had quite a career, Teddy Long. Still around, of course, but he was one of the classic managers from this era. Also had a spell as a referee later, and had a long career, has done a lot in the business, but he's in the Skyscrapers corners, and they are facing the Road Warriors, Hawk and Animal. WWF fans might know them as Legion of Doom, but Road Warriors back here during their peak era, and they are managed by Paul Ellering. It's a Chicago street fight, which is said to be like the Road Warriors type of match. So basically no rules. But the Skyscrapers, they have a new guy involved because there's like an injury to Dan Spivey. So we have Mean Mark here, and that's Mark Callis, who went on to become The Undertaker in the WWF. So one of the biggest names of all time in the business. He had very modest start though. But here he's part of this tag team, the Skyscrapers, this sort of big muscle team, and it's not long. It's later in the year anyway, he would leave for the WWF. But at this time he's with the Skyscrapers. His regular partner, Dan Spivey, has been injured. So we've got a replacement, which is this mysterious man under a hood. Um, and it's kind of bizarre in a way because the commentators are hyping him up. Obviously, the fact he's under a mask means he is this mystery man. You don't really know who he is. But it's also odd because they're kind of making a big deal over his muscles and he's this big loaded guy. But in reality, he doesn't really come off. He doesn't look that muscly. He doesn't look that massive, at least to me. Probably next to Callis, he looks pretty small anyway. But yeah, I just didn't quite buy that. But he's meant to be this big muscly guy, and certainly he has a decent build. But kind of the way they were hyping it was a bit weird. But just to let you know, he's Mike Enos, who would go on to be in the Beverly Brothers in the WWF a couple of years later. So that's who that is. That's Mike Enos, who was filling in for the injured Dan Spivey. So we kind of get some comedy spots at the start with Teddy Long kind of. Again, I think he really sells this character very well as this kind of he kind of has aspirations to be a tough guy, but in reality he's a bit of a weaselly wimp, and we kind of get this back and forth with him and Paul Ellering, who his character is more than he is this tough guy who just happens to be a manager, and he's this no nonsense sort of guy. So he gets a few shots in on Teddy Long at the start of the match. And the Road Warriors, I'd say, have that classic badass theme, which is kind of like the Black Sabbath music, that classic Black Sabbath tune, which is an awesome like theme for wrestlers. It just sends chills down your spine. So it's awesome stuff. I love it as an entrance. And this is just a different style of matches. It's very hard hitting, wild, out of control brawl, some big high spots, some really back and forth. They use some chairs. The chair shots look a little tame, but they kind of do the job. A lot of people, I mean, for some, this is like one of the weaker matches on the card. It probably is, to be fair. And compared to some brawls you see, some street fights, it's pretty tame. It probably lasts a bit too long as well for what it is. I think these sorts of matches, they work best when they're a bit quicker. But there are some decent enough spots, and I think as a bit of variety, it works okay. It's something a bit different on the card. I think a lot of the best wrestling cards are the ones where you have a bit of everything throughout the night. I think you need that sort of variety. So the match sort of does serve a purpose. It's a bit overlong and it's a bit sloppy with certain moves. I quite like Animal doing a drop kick. That always looks really good for a man of his size. He really gets off the ground. Hawk clothesline off the apron is one of the more dramatic sort of spots. And they get the Doomsday device for the win, which always looks pretty good. And it was pretty obvious they were always going to go over the Road Warriors. For what it wasn't too bad, and I quite like that they brawled to the back at the end, so they continued the feud. That's a very old school thing to actually brawl to the back, and they go off and you don't really see what happens, but that's the idea. Then they're continuing the fight backstage. I always enjoy stuff like that. Anyway, I'll give it about 2 stars. I don't really think it's forgettable mostly, but it kind of had its moments. It sort of served a purpose. And yeah, I said before, so that's my rating for that, 2 stars. I'll just try and remember if I rated everything up to now. I'm pretty sure I did, but 2 stars for the Chicago street fight. Next, we get another tag team match. So this was really a strong era for tag team wrestling. This card is loaded with some big name tag teams. So next we have the US tag team title match. So the Fabulous Freebirds, Michael PSAs and Jimmy Jan Garvin, go up against the new team of Flying Brian and the Z-Man. So they are the defending US tag champions. And in this match, it's their first title defense. So they won the belts in the tournament, and the tournament final was them against the Freebirds. So that's the match they won the belts in. So this is sort of like a rematch. The Freebirds, the more experienced of the two teams. Flying Brian, Seaman, both sadly no longer with us. R.I.P. Seaman died more recently over the last few years. Tom Sink, Pillman tragically died in 1997 when he was with the WWF. He was only 35 around that, so that really tragic. But two of WCW's bright hopes during this era, two really electric high flyers. Sink sort of known for more being in tag teams, whereas Pillman broke out and had a decent little singles run. But yeah, I think out of the two, Pillman was easily the better talent. He was this classic underdog type wrestler, I think, at this point, but really did some revolutionary stuff for kind of aerial wrestling during this period. But they made quite a nice little tag team anyway, going up against the more experienced Freebirds. So rematch from the tournament final. We get the classic Fabulous Freebirds entrance. I think this was one of the early sort of examples of rock and roll and pro wrestling mixing. So we have the Bass Street USA theme. That it's another entrance theme from this era. Really gets my blood sort of pumping when they come out dancing and strutting, and they really work the crowd. They've got sort of mascara on their around their eyes, and just very glamorous. And they sort of, because of the era, it's a very heel sort of gimmick where the fans tend to get on them a bit, and don't they look like sort of Nancy Poison stuff? It's very much of the era. I mean, it might well be different now, but anyway, they really carry it off very well. They're really charismatic and very good, and them singing their own theme and coming to the ring with that theme is always an iconic moment for me when I rewatch these older matches. And I sort of love the Terry Funk being really old-fashioned and hate, because Jim Ross compares them to like Alice Cooper. And Funk saying, no, I do not like Alice Cooper, saying I'm more into I'm more of a John Wayne type guy, even though he's not a musician, but that's kind of the sort of guy he likes. But so bit of banter there, and let's get into the match. So the Freebirds again really selling for the faces. They really take some high flying moves, some double drop kicks, for example, and we get these leopard skin tights with the Freebirds sort of strutting around the ring, but we get them being outsmarted in the early exchanging. I really like Pillman's flying clothesline, because he actually came from a football background. He sort of used that quite nicely in wrestling, where he would do these flying blocks, sort of aerial moves, really athletic. So for a smaller man, quite well built actually, Pillman, but he would sort of utilise a lot of that in wrestling, like the flying blocks, flying clothesline. Garvin, dodges a second seaman drop kick but then is caught with his head down, so again outsmart. One of the spots, probably the spot of the match, is Pillman getting a crucifix counter for a near fall, really hot near fall, but crucifix, a really great move, and really always looks good, especially if the other man does his sort of side of it. And yeah, the faces start off really hot and heavy. Crossbody for a 2 count looks very good. Sunset flips, also all these big aerial type moves. And slowly the heels sort of wrestle their way back into the match. A few dirty tactics, a few sharp rights. But they start focusing on, they're the more, I mean, you get wrestling from both, but they start targeting arms and working on various body parts with an arm drag. I sort of like the reference to Flying Fred Curry from Jim Ross. He claims that growing up he was Pillman's favourite wrestler. I have no idea who Flying Fred Curry is, folks. But yeah, it must be a real guy if JR references him, but maybe you can tell me in the comments below. But I did enjoy that. And as I said, slowly the heel works their way and match their focus on the arms. Some sharp rights sort of building towards like Hayes's DDT, one of the best DDTs in the business. That's another very simple move that looks so great when it's done right. Can look really bad and dodgy when it's not done right. So some decent near falls back and forth. Crossbody off the top gets a 2, but double freebirds, elbows come back, so we get this sort of back and forth where the faces are being worn down and they make these sporadic sort of comebacks, but then quickly the heels are back on top of them. Sort of Garvin nails a sort of like sort of Seaman off the top with this club in like axe handle type blow. We get sleeper holds there, 2.5 count, and a ground approach now from the Freebirds with Garvin. I mean, this part of the match dragged a little bit, but again, sound wrestling. We get the Alice Cooper reference along the way. Hayes double axe handle off the top. We get sort of a running bulldog, which looks really good. But Pillman breaks the count. But again, sort of logical moves building up to the DDT. So everything has a logic, as sort of a meaning. So by doing the running bulldog, you're attacking the neck. It's sort of a setup move building to Hayes going for his DDT. But Pillman saves the count on that. Multiple drop kicks. He sort of gets the hot tag, flying clothesline on both the Freebirds. I really enjoyed that spot. Hayes like brings the belt in at one point, which you're not sure is that if he uses it, he might get DQ'd, but it's kind of showing that he's lost his head. But yeah, it's and then it's taken away anyway, so he doesn't get to use it. Pillman drags him and Garvin away. And Jimmy is hit with a crossbody off the top. And the Freebirds go for a double team, but and Pillman hits a crossbody onto Garvin at the opportune time. And it's like that surprise factor that takes him out and gets the 1-2-3. So Pillman and Sink retain the US Tag Team title. So very enjoyable match, some inventive spots. I think the contrast in styles is partly what made it a really great match, and I do enjoy when you have a really good established heel team like that against the more gutsy sort of youngsters. It worked well, the contrast in styles. My only real criticism is that it did last too long, and I think that's a bit of a theme on the show. Yeah, the match is over long. It's over 20 minutes, which I think for a match like this is a bit too long. I think it could have been shortened to like 15 minutes, 15, 17 minutes, but yeah, over 20 minutes was too long for the match, and that did take away a bit. But overall, it was a really good match, and I think the Freebirds did a good job in putting Z-Man and Flying Brian over as a team, but they still kept their sort of heat and still look good in their own way. And they do actually they get attack after the match. They get a sneaky heel attack after the bell to keep their heat, to keep things rolling in the feud. But I thought I enjoyed the match a lot despite it being a bit over long, and I'll give it 3.5 stars. So another strong tag team match. And Pillman was nailed with the DDT after the bell, I should say that. So we got the big DDT moment after all, which I love. Next up, we have another title match. It's the NWA Tag Team title match. So it's the first appearance of the Four Horsemen, and we have Arn Anderson and Ole Anderson versus the Steiner brothers, Rick and Scott. So they are the defending NWA Tag Team champions. And it's built as the battle of two brother teams. Ross gives it the big push. It's the first time that two brothers teams have competed for the NWA title. But in reality, the Steiner brothers were real life brothers, although Arn and Ole were not. They weren't real brothers, but I think what's brilliant about them together is that when you see them, you would be convinced that they are brothers, because they do look a lot alike. And yeah, you would believe they are brothers, but funnily enough, it turns out they are not. But they're heel challengers representing the Horsemen. Arn Anderson, one of the greatest tag team wrestlers of all time, may well be the greatest tag team wrestlers of all time. And he was one of these guys, was very loyal to WCW throughout his career, spent most of his career there, had a short spell in the WWF for a year, which was in '89, came back and was pretty much loyal throughout. And yeah, so we're going to talk more about Arn Anderson over the coming months, but so it's him and Ole as the challengers, and the Steiner brothers, one of the hottest tag teams of this era. They may well be the hottest, would go on to some really great stuff. And one of my favourite tag teams of all time, really, just their style. This match, you don't really see much of it. You don't see their expansive style too much. It's more of a slow building, grounded wrestling match. You get a lot of basic sort of stuff, really stiff back and forth. You do get some fun stuff with the Steiner brothers kind of throwing the challengers around, sort of playing with their heads. You of course get the eccentric Rick Steiner character, the dog-faced gremlin as he's known. He gets down on all fours at some point. But we see them, they're sort of outsmarting the heels, having a bit of fun. The crowd pop well for them. I do like Arn kind of attempting a knee drop, and it's Scott, I think, catching the knee in midair and then stands him up, and Arn goes for the kick, but he spins him around, nails him with clothesline. Really good stuff. I love the visual of his knee being caught in midair and then back to a vertical base for the move. And the way Arn sells it is brilliant. You really believe he's sort of terrified, but it's quite a unique sort of move. And it's a very solid sort of match. We see some nice suplexes from the Steiners. but it's not full on Steiner Brothers. We don't really see their array of moves we would see in other matches. It's more of a slow build, sort of solid wrestling move. So we see the heels go to different body parts at different times. You get a few nice double teams, but it doesn't really flow as like a great wrestling match. It's certainly not the best match you'll see these wrestlers involved in. I think Ole was more of a previous era in a way. He's a solid enough wrestler, but he certainly doesn't set the world alight for me anyway. The Steiner brothers would have better matches, as would Arn Anderson, but it's a very solid match. I can't complain too much about it. And the Steiner brothers end up winning. They get the they retain the title with the Frankensteiner from Scott Steiner, which always looks fantastic. So they get the win. And it's a solid match. It's not a great match, and like we saw in the previous match, the heels do get their heat back with attacking Scott. And there's been this storyline throughout the match where they've sort of focused on Scott's arm, and they go back to that after the match. So a move off the top onto the shoulder, and it's really sold very well, and there's this possibility it could sort of be broken. So it's almost that thing where, although the Steiners have retained the belts, it's kind of this sense then the Horsemen get the last laugh, and by damaging his shoulder, could that mean the Steiners might have to give up the belts and the Horsemen could be in line to pick them up somewhere along the line? So again, a great example of the heels getting their heat back after the bell, and it adds a little something to the feud after the match and keeps it bubbling along. So a nice little touch there, and a solid enough match, if not a great match. So I'll give the match 3 stars. That's the World Tag Team title match. And we have just one more match left, which is the main event, the NWA title. Lex Luger, the US champion, challenges Ric Flair for the NWA belt. So before the match, Luger gives a very sort of bland and generic babyface promo with Gordon Soley. We get a much smoother promo from the defending champion Ric Flair and his manager woman, the late Nancy. So very tragic what obviously happened to her many years later, but a sad part of history really. But she had a long history dating back to the late 80s and was associated with Ric Flair many times over the years, and I think one of the very early like heel female managers. And she did a really good job, really good chemistry with Flair, really one of those that got heavily involved in the matches and really convincing the way she rooted for a man. She would often sort of scream and really get into the match, but I think you could tell at this point she had a decent amount of experience and was a credible sort of like backup for Flair at ringside. So pretty smooth promo, but we're obviously building the story of the night, which is Sting's, that he's out on crutches, but he's at the arena. He wants to see the match. And the whole thing came about, the injury, because he wanted to challenge Flair for the NWA title. And this was seen as a betrayal by the Horsemen. So they put Sting out of motion. But Sting is here, he's on crutches, and he walks out to the ring, gets a decent pop before the match, so he's at ringside to watch the match, Luger versus Flair, for the NWA title, champion versus champion, but it is only Ric Flair's title that is at stake. So I really like Luger's entrance, his really pumping sort of rock sort of theme. Really cool theme, it looks good. He obviously is really jacked at this point. very athletic, although yeah, very limited in the ring. He always was, to be fair. But you really, his sort of model, you can tell he's a very 1980s bodybuilder type wrestling. Another one with a football background. But his theme was always cool. This early Luger theme, anyway. I always enjoyed his entrances. Nice little fireworks sort of display, but very much pull over as the top contender going in. And so good sort of entrance. And we really see what a great talent, what a great leader and champion Flair was, because of the way he carries the whole match, the more limited Luger. He really draws a lot of heat from the crowd. At one point, similar to the Cornette spot earlier, but we get a back and forth with the ref, and the ref shoves him down, and Flair sells just how pissed off, just how embarrassed he is. It's that thing of the heel getting up in the referee's face, but then being bumped down to earth, almost being shown off by the, and it almost puts the referee over as well. It's a really nice spot. Just touches like that I miss from wrestling. I miss these referees being guys who were quite tough in their own right, or they wouldn't take any notice. They wouldn't take any nonsense. So it's almost like Flair's trying to be a bit of a bully. He's trying to dictate to the referee how the match is going to go, and the referee just shoves him right back, and it's brilliant. Flair sells it so well, and it gets a nice little pop from the referee, but an old school sort of referee style spot. And it comes off where Flair is complaining about Luger supposedly pulling his hair where he's knocked him down. And we get some, again, really showing off Flair's sort of ego and him challenging Luger to test strengths, which he's not really going to win, but it's kind of this really building up Flair's like charisma and ego, and that maybe he's just a bit off his game, he's not thinking, and that becomes a sort of a theme. But I think Flair's a great example, like the Midnight, during this era, where they would have really great matches, consistent matches, but they had their set routines, but they would also mix things up. So I really like the spot during this match where we get them going off the ropes, and Flair actually catches Luger in a shoulder tackle, and it knocks Lex down, almost like it surprises him. Luger is the much bigger guy, so that's a bit. But then they continue over, and we actually get a leapfrog from Luger. So a more aerial move from Luger, nicely done. And he catches Flair coming off the ropes again. So we get them mixing things up and doing some different things as well. Flair takes a press slam. As I said, shoulder block tackle. Luger actually goes after the knee. He gets a figure 4 leg lock at one point. Flair's own hold. Gets a 2 count on that before he gets to the ropes. Finally escapes. And Flair dodges a running clothesline, and Luger hits hard on the floor. So that's sort of the first turning point. He hits the guardrail. It's sort of interesting how early on he's taking these guardrail shots, and it sort of does affect him, but over the course of the match he builds up that adrenaline and starts bouncing back from these shots. Credit to Luger actually, because some good selling here. He's not known as a great worker at this time, but possibly never was, but he does some good job here, some good selling, some quite dramatic reactions. We get the hard Ric Flair chops, those vintage like reverse chops slapping into Luger's chest. Really echoes throughout the arena. it's such a famous part of Flair's repertoire. Luger actually comes back several times from those. We get some good chain wrestling back and forth, some power moves. But yeah, wrapping Luger's legs around the ropes, working on the legs, trying to build towards his own version, his own, vintage figure four. Series of blows back and forth. Luger's flying forearm comes into play. Flair sort of sells it really well. We get a slide down off the ropes. We get the aeroplane flip in the corner, the classic Flair aeroplane flip. And we get Flair sort of responding with a chop back and forth, but Luger slams him off the top, so the rocket launcher spot as well. And we get a Luger sleeper, which woman sells really well. She really screeches and is getting nervous about her man and maybe him losing the title. Belly to back suplex as a counter. We get a second Luger sleeper attempt, but this time he is Luger suplex by Flair, but then Flair is caught. He gets his leg wrapped around the ring post. And Luger hits Flair with an impressive power slam off the ropes for a near fall, one of the closest near falls of the match up to this point. Luger blocks a hip toss, and then we get a backslide for another close 2.5 counts, half a count away from a new NWA champion. And Flair bounces off the top again. We get a second 2 count in a row from a clothesline. Double arm suplex from Flair, so he's mixing it up, coming back with a bit more variety now. Nice little suplex move. And I love the sleeper actually that follows from Ric, where he actually jumps on Luger's back to try and make up for the size difference, the physical difference on Luger's back. He holds the hold for a couple of different minutes. Luger sort of struggles out of it, breaks the hold, but Flair, with a sneaky roll-up, almost snatches the victory away. Then a running clothesline from Luger looks really good. Flair sells it really well. But then he misses an elbow drop and the match takes another turn. And it's sort of slowly going through the gears as Flair then focuses on the challenger's knee and again building towards the figure four. Chop blocks the knee, finally hooks the figure four, and he's getting all these near falls. So the figure four, basically a submission hold, but is a hold where you can actually pin the guy if their shoulders go down. And the more Luger fights it, the more pain he's in, the more tired he gets, and Flair gets a couple of near falls. He is, of course, the dirtiest player in the game, as he's known, and he shows that here as he puts his hand, grabs the top rope as the figure four is there. It's on the blind side of the referee, but it gives him more leverage, and he gets a couple of close counts. Sting then comes down to ringside. He'd sort of been up on the ramp watching the match, but he makes his way down. He gets a big pop. And I really like this story it tells here with Sting and Lex, because really that they'd not been friends going into this. They'd been sort of opposites at each other's sort of throat, not particularly much history between them. But Sting comes in and he gets up in Luger's face. Luger has finally, there's a roll through where Luger reverses the hold, Flair rolls it again, and they sort of end up in the ropes. So the hold is broken, and Sting at this point has come down to ringside, and he gets up in Luger's face. He really screams at him, "Come on," fires him up. I think he gives him a little slap as well. It's a really great moment, a really good babyface type moment, and Luger responds and sort of bounces up, and he suddenly becomes almost like the Ultimate Warrior, but Luger's build and stuff, it is really credible. So Flair just bounces off him almost. So Sting has fired him off. Press slam, rocket launcher, really building this momentum. We get a top rope move from Luger. Clothesline. Flair is then suplexed back inside the ring. That looks really good. That gets 2 1/4, or 3/4, I should say, very, very close. He gets another 2 count from the power slam, but again, this sequence of moves all build into his big move, which is the human torture rack, the sort of submission holds. But when Luger is going for the pin on the power slam, Woman goes after him, gives him sort of a slap which breaks up the count. I think she kind of does it over the shoulder of the referee. Really, I don't know how the ref misses it, but whatever, it's her breaking up the count, golding Luger into the whole situation. And then it's Sting then gets involved, but as I said, after the power slam and the suplex, Woman then gets involved, and then the Horseman comes out, and because Sting has sort of gone, the Horsemen come out. They try to save Rick. But Luger fights the Horseman off. He gets the torture rack, but there's no referee, so Ric Flair seems to be on the verge of submitting. No referee. The Horsemen have come out. Referee finally gets back up, but what we see, which is this big payoff to this storyline, is that Sting is on the outside of the ring. He's vulnerable. So the 2 horsemen, Arn and Anderson, they go after Sting on crutches. They attack Sting. And Luger is the torture rack, still waiting for the referee to come around. He's slowly coming around, but Flair has been in it for a while. And on the verge of submitting, Luger is on the verge of winning the NWA title. But he does the heroic thing. He sees Sting in trouble, sees that Sting is vulnerable. He breaks the human torture rack. He lets Flair go. He goes outside. He fights off the Horseman. He saves Sting. So back and forth with the Horseman. But as a result of him back and forth with the 2 horsemen, he's tied up. And he can't get back to the ring in time. The referee in position counts 10. Lex Luger is counted out. Ric Flair retains the NWA title with help from the Horsemen. But it tells this great story of Luger and Sting coming together as friends. Lex doing a big sort of babyface gesture by sacrificing his title opportunity to save Sting, and he obviously got caught out. Sneaky Horseman move, outsmarted the face. You could say a bit of a cheap finish, but it works. It makes sense because this feud is going to continue over the month. It's almost like a stopgap feud a little bit, but waiting for Sting to recover so he can eventually challenge Flair. But you know, Lex is a credible challenger at this point, and it's a big sort of babyface move. And it starts really the close friendship between him and Sting, which was a real life friendship. They sort of trained together and, spent a lot of time together outside the ring. So they were close friends in reality. But this was the start of this kind of on-screen sort of connection. And the Steiner brothers come out post-match to like even up the score. So we're sort of seeing them as like the sort of big, kind of like B faces, if you like, B level faces, backing up Sting and Luger, the two top faces. But yeah, I thought it was a nice little finish and worked well. And it was a brilliant match. It held your attention. It was a long match, but it justified the length. It really, really athletic back and forth, told a good story, good crowd heat. Flair did a great job. It shows what a fantastic worker he was to carry Luger, who was very limited. But really put him over well. It's a classic example how you do that. You have a great match, you put the guy over. Luger was still strong in defeat. Of course, it was his decision to go out and save Sting. But at the same time, it keeps the belt on Flair. It keeps the heat on Flair. Both guys are protected. But at this time, the NWA, WCW, they consider Luger one of the future stars. So, yeah, Flair had to do a job. He essentially got to keep the belt at the end of the night, but he did his job in putting Luger over and giving him probably the best match of his career at this point. But really great main event, told a great story. I love what it did with Sting at the end. So I'm going to give it 4 stars for it was a really, really strong match. Which basically means that and the Midnight Express match were the 2 top matches. And that's no coincidence, because really the Midnight Express and Ric Flair were the kind of top workers at this point in the NWA. They would often steal the show, and you could almost guarantee that most nights, most pay-per-views, they would have the best sort of matches. So it's close between the two, but best match of the night I'm going to give to the main event, to the NWA title match, because I just think Flair does such a stellar job in putting Luger over, making him look like a great talent, a much greater talent. It ticked all the boxes, really emotional, told a good story, really carried. Flair does such a great job in carrying things, and really connected with the crowd. It really built to a crescendo, if you like. I really enjoyed the Midnight match as well, so that would be a close second. But match of the night I will give to the NWA title. There were a few mediocre matches as well. Worst match of the night, I'm going to say Cactus Jack Manson against Norman the Lunatic. You know, there's a place for comedy wrestling, but this was the bad kind, really. It didn't do much for me, despite Cactus Jack's awesome bumps. But yeah, that's my least favourite match of the night. Overall, I'd say this was a strong pay-per-view, which could have been a bit better at times. The US tag title match I enjoyed a lot, but as I said, was a bit overlong. That should have been cut down. A couple of the matches were too long, and there were a couple of needless filler matches near the start, which didn't really feel like they belonged on the pay-per-view. So I think that dragged the quality down a little bit. But overall, there was some great wrestling and some standout matches. So for the overall event, I'm going to give it 7.5 out of 10. So a really strong rating. And that's my thoughts on Wrestlewar 1990, Wild Things. So a pretty damn good start to the year on pay-per-view for the NWA WCW. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I've gone pretty long talking about it, but overall I'd say a strong pay-per-view with, as I said, 2 really good matches And couple of enjoyable, a few mediocre, but overall a really strong card, I thought. So if you agree with my rating, let me know, comments below, and I will return soon with my next pay-per-view review. So the second pay-per-view of 1990, and that is going to be Capital Combat, which, no surprise, it takes place in the capital, and that had the subtitle RoboCop's Return. Yes, you heard me, RoboCop's Return. And that's something I was hinting at earlier. That has to be seen to believe. And another example of Bill Hurd and his sort of wacky ideas for wrestling. But I'll explain the whole story next time. But Capital Combat will be my next pay-per-view review. So thank you very much for listening to this first review of Wrestlewar. It went a bit long. I probably won't spend this long very often, but to kick things off, I wanted to set the stage. But let me know your thoughts again on Wrestlewar 1990, and look out for more pay-per-view reviews coming up over the next few months. I'm going to do the whole decade on pay-per-view for WCW. But thanks for watching. I'll see you guys again soon.